Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. Today I'm going to talk about comedy in current comic books. And I'm going to talk about comedy in relation to your traditional idea of hero. Because I think if you look at comedy, the way that they try to present it within current comic books, it explains a lot of what they are doing and why they focus on so many tropes, really. And these are current tropes that they use, not ones that they've ever used before. Now, before I even begin, I have to say 3 quick things. Number 1, I'm going to talk about comedy in an academic way. I am not funny. I know my limitations. I'm not going to try to be funny. That's not what this video is about. Number 2, I realize that comedy has many different variations. All I'm giving here is the baseline of comedy that has run through Western civilization for a minimum of 2,400 years. So I know people in the comments are going to say, what about this? What about that? What about this kind of comedy and that kind of comedy? I realize there are many different forms. I'm just giving you the baseline that runs through Western civilization. And number 3, when I present an argument, I usually try to present it in a logical and rational way to the best of my ability. And so I certainly realize that ad hominem attacks and reductio ad absurdum, that is to say, to reduce things to absurdity, are logical fallacies. But they're logical fallacies when they're not connected in a clear and rational way to how things actually work within reality. But if you show something to be absurd or ridiculous in the fact that it is not in accord with reality, well, that's not reductio ad absurdum. And when you point out that someone is doing something ridiculous, that is to say, something that is not in accord with reality, that's not an ad hominem attack when you are actually basing it upon logic and reason. So with that out of the way, first of all, I'm going to look at Aristotle's idea of what a comedy is. And as I said in my last video, the reason why I go back to Aristotle is because he gave these underlying definitions of what literature should be, and those underlying conditions were met throughout Western civilization as the basis for what a story is actually supposed to be. And I would say rightly so, because he was basing it upon logical and rational principles. And in order to look at and understand what he defines a comedy as, I think that it's best to look at what he thinks a hero is, first of all. One of the reasons being that we have a full text of what he thinks a hero is and how you develop a hero, but his text on comedy is actually lost. And so we can only pick out bits and pieces of what he defines a comedy as within his talking about heroic and tragic and dramatic situations. So I went over this whole thing in my last video, so I'm only going to do it very briefly here. And if you want to go back and listen to that last video, I'll link it at the end. It's the one with Batman in the thumbnail. But if you look at the rational way which Aristotle defines a hero, which was carried on through Western civilization right to the present day, and is very present within your comic books, certainly your older comic books. That definition of a hero was that he is a paragon of virtue. You are writing something that is an imitation of a man who is better than the norm. And he is better than the norm by being virtuous. And so he becomes a paragon of virtue. This is what makes him better than the norm. Now, when you look at that statement itself, that a hero is someone who is better than the norm, and he is better than the norm by being virtuous, and you look at the way he defines virtue and how it points to these larger truths, these things like the true, the good, and the beautiful, well, this is something which is referencing a universal. So when he says the norm, your hero is better than the normal person, he is not talking about the normal person as defined by the fact that this is how the majority of people act, and defining normal as being what the majority of people do. No, there are universals that govern people's actions, that define what a person is, that define what a person's nature is, and what he is supposed to do with his life, and therefore this would define what is normal. So your statement there about a hero is a reference to something that is universal in 2 ways, because your virtues, they point to a universal, and the fact that he is saying that this hero is better than the norm, this norm is defined by your universals as well. And like I said in my last video, these quote-unquote progressive people who run comics and other entertainment industries, they can't abide any kind of universal at all. Because if you look at the practical application of their ideology, it is based upon rampant selfishness. And that rampant selfishness takes itself to the extreme that they have to define what reality is by their subjective thoughts, beliefs, and feelings. So they say, I can define what reality is according to how I feel. And it plays out in these ideas like, I can define how old I am, it doesn't matter how long I've been alive. I can define what species I am, it doesn't matter what I was born. Because they're saying that there are no objective norms, I define what reality is by how I feel. And so, one of the bases of their ideology is the destruction of universals altogether. Now, if we go from hero into comedy, what is Aristotle's definition of comedy? Well, it's a bit of the reverse from what a hero is, because your comedy is supposed to be a representation of a man who is worse than the norm. And he says that this fault that makes this person worse is of one particular kind. It is the ridiculous. And the ridiculous is a form of the ugly. And he further goes on to say that this mistake, that this deformity in the actions of the person is something that doesn't produce pain or harm. And he says that quite specifically, I would say, because if what you are doing does cause pain or harm, then it's no longer a comedy. Then that brings it squarely into tragedy territory. And this is where I'd say we get the English idiom of, I would laugh at this if it wasn't so tragic. You say to yourself, this would be funny if it didn't cause pain or harm. Because if it causes pain or harm, it's actually tragic, it's not funny. So that's what a comedy is supposed to be. It's supposed to be pointing out this fault within others in a way that doesn't cause pain or harm. And it is a representation of a person who is worse than the norm. Now, right off the bat, we see that, again, this person is supposed to be worse than the norm in this ridiculous way, in this ugly way. This is once again pointing towards a universal, because the norm is defined by universals. And if you don't have that norm, therefore, you can't tell whether the person is worse or not. And since these progressive people have to eliminate all universals, well then, quite simply, you can't have comedy. Certainly not in the way that we are used to, and that has run straight through Western civilization for at least 2,400 years. You can't have comedy if you don't have a universal, because you don't have a norm. And further, if we look at this statement, when he talks about pain or harm, he is of course talking about pain or harm in relation to these universals once again. Because you have these progressive people, and they say, well, no, I define what reality is. I define everything by how I feel. And therefore, I can tell you that because of my feelings, when you say something to me, when you use words, you are causing pain or harm to me, and therefore I get to define what pain or harm is. But of course, when we go back to this ancient Greek way of thinking about things, no, it doesn't work that way. Pain or harm is specifically defined by something objective. And that's the only way it can work. He is defining pain or harm according to what is objective. He's not talking about words. Words are not painful. Words are not harmful. Quite the opposite. If you look at the actual Greek about what he talks about, the ridiculous, when he uses the word ridiculous, it is derived from a Greek word, I think it's galeo, which means to laugh at. Not to laugh, but to laugh at. Because you are laughing at someone or something. But if you look at the word that he uses for ugly, that ugly that he's talking about, it's not ugly in the sense of bad that most of us would think about. It's ugly in the sense of shameful. This is the ugly that he's talking about. That's what the original Greek expresses. So when you're talking about shameful actions, you're obviously talking about a person. You can't have things, you can't have inanimate objects do shameful things. It is people who do shameful things. And therefore, when you talk about the ridiculous, that is to say, to laugh at, as it is in the Greek, to laugh at is either directed at a person or a thing, and a thing cannot be shameful, then he's specifically talking about laughing at a person. This is what comedy is supposed to be about. Your person, who is worse than the norm, is doing something shameful, and you are laughing at him. And that doesn't cause pain or harm. Quite specifically, he states that right in his definition. That's not something that causes actual pain or harm when you laugh at someone. Now, here we have something which I've talked about in older videos. We're talking about these people doing something shameful. And when you look at this definition and you look at Western civilization itself, when you look at older cultures like the Romans and the Greeks, they had a different culture than what came after them, which was a Christian culture, because their cultures were shame cultures, whereas the Christian culture was a guilt culture. And those two things are very different. And people were asking me the last time I brought this up in a video, whether I was just making all this up. No, this is actual classical academic academic thought. I think the person, if I remember correctly, who explained it most that I know of would be F.M. Cornford, if you're looking for any kind of reference. Anyways, these older cultures were shame cultures. And the difference between a shame culture and a guilt culture is the fact that shaming is something that happens externally. If you do something wrong and you get caught in doing that something wrong, then the people around you will point the finger at you and say, you did something wrong. And they do that in a way that will destroy some of your social standing. And so they will destroy some of your social mobility. And so this destruction of your social mobility, if you want to reinstate it, you actually have to put in some work so that you are no longer doing this shameful thing and you are no longer tainted with this shame. That's the way shame culture works. But within guilt culture, everything is internalized. So every person has this internalized system of what is right and wrong. Your Christians would say this is internalized anyways because of your conscience. And this internal system, when you do something wrong, well, the person who points his finger at you and says you've done something wrong is yourself. It's not someone else, it's you. And so you point your finger at yourself and say, I did something wrong. I know I did something wrong. Therefore, I'm going to have to rectify this situation if I am to get this wrong thing out of my life. Now, two very specific things go along with this. If you look at your progressive people, especially these people in comic books and who are producing comics, and you wonder why they're on social media all the time, well, it's very specific because the whole progressive ideal is trying to bring us back to a shame culture instead of a guilt culture. I would say the major reason for that is they want to destroy, as they see it, the last vestiges of Christianity within people and within society, and so they're going to bring us back into a shame culture instead of a guilt culture, which is quite specifically Christian. They want a shame culture. That's what they're trying to build. And they're on social media because they use it as a shaming tool. It's all about society. It's all about pointing the finger in a shame culture. It's socially pointing the finger. And that's why they're so attached to social media and things of the like, because they're trying to bring us back to a shame culture. And very briefly, if you're thinking to yourself, I'm talking very academically, and this is something that doesn't really happen nor affect the normal person, I would say no. I used to do research, and part of my research was to look into different curriculums within school systems around North America. And this is the system that has been built within the school system for quite some time now. It is a shame culture. They built it in as a shame culture. And it continues all the way through grade school, right up into college or university. This is what they have built within the academic world. And if you don't believe me, and your kid does something within a public school, when they say something that they think is funny, and the other person says, no, that hurt my feelings, and I get to define what reality is and what harm is by my feelings, and you go in to defend your kid and say, look, he was just joking. Sticks and stones can break my bones, but names will never hurt me. If you use that statement within a public school setting today, they will rip you to shreds because they will say, we do not ascribe to that anymore. That's an old idea. We have gotten rid of that long ago. No, we don't use that. And why? Because it's a shame culture. But anyways, the second thing is that no matter what you think about a shame culture or a guilt culture, whether you think both of them are bad or one of them is better than the other, I'll have to say the following. If you look at the two systems, you will see that a guilt culture is actually much more efficient than a shame culture. And why? Because in a shame culture, the whole system only kicks in if you get caught. And when it does kick in, it's other people pointing the finger at you, and other people have a tendency to get things wrong. And on top of that, when you actually do what you need to do in order to get this shame off of you, you could actually be pretending. You don't actually have to mean it. You just have to look like you mean it socially. But in a guilt culture, as long as you're being honest with yourself, the person who catches you is yourself, and therefore you are always caught. And the person who points the finger at you is yourself, and therefore there is no bad interpretation because you did it, and then you pointed the finger at yourself. And when you have to rectify the situation, you're the one who determines whether or not you actually rectified it. And again, as long as you're being honest with yourself, you will say, yes, I actually rectified the situation, or no, I actually didn't do what I was supposed to do. So your guilt culture actually works in a much more efficient way than your shame culture. And so what your shame culture actually has to do in order to make up for all this is that they have to have tighter and tighter control upon society. These rules that they place upon society have to be more and more and more restrictive. And that's what you see going on today, because these progressives and all the people around them, they're trying to institute a shame culture. And so they have to tighten their grip, they have to tighten the reins, they have to clamp down on everything, especially socially. And that's how they institute their shame culture. And we can see this playing out within comics, but I'll get to that in a minute. Let's go back to comedy for a second. The problem is, why these progressive people can't use comedy at all is the fact that you can't have comedy and a shame culture together within one society unless you have one specific element that balances the two. And that specific element that you need to balance the two in order to have the two within one society is universals. Because if you have a universal, then you can decide what is actual harm, what is actual pain. You can define that universally. And if you don't have that universal to define what pain or harm is, if you are defining pain or harm according to the subjective ideas and how you feel, like these progressive people do, then the person themselves is the one who defines what shame or harm is. And so they can always say, yes, this is shameful or harmful to me. Or you could do something right now which isn't shameful or harmful in their eyes, but a week from now it might be. Because they have no universal to say, no, this is not shameful or harmful now, nor will it ever be. And since they don't have that mechanism to use, they destroy universals and have to get them out, then they don't have the ability to say that shame or harm is this, and it is always this, and therefore, when we make fun of someone, when we laugh at someone, it's not causing them pain or harm. And that's the basis of what comedy actually is. And besides that fact, if you look deep into their ideology and what they're trying to do with this shame, it always leads back to harm. What they intend with this shame, these progressives, what they intend with this shame is harm. That's what they want to do with it. When they have this ideology where it is based upon critical theory, not critical thinking, which is supposed to criticize something to the point of destroying it, that's the entire purpose of critical theory, by the way, which is one of the bases of their ideology. It is to criticize something until it is destroyed. And that destruction is harm. And this criticism, this shaming, is a part of their criticism. And it is intended to destroy. That is the entire purpose of it, is to cause harm. And so almost everything that I read at the first of this video about the definition of what comedy is contradicted by their ideology. You can't have a person which is worse than the norm because you can't define what the norm is. You can't have a standard definition of what pain or harm is because that goes against their ideology. You can't have shame that is intended for another purpose besides shame or harm because, again, that goes against what their ideology states. And so they can't have comedy. When they try to put something into a comic or any other media that is what they think of as funny, it's not funny at all because it's not comedy. And this would explain, as I said at the first, many of these new tropes that you see within comics. Because let's take, for example, having something that is silly. You know, you have a talking dog or a talking cat, and they think, oh, that's silly. Yeah, that's comedy, right? No, it's not. Or they reference some other comedy within pop culture, so they don't have to take responsibility for that comedy at all. And a reference to another kind of comedy is not in itself comedy. Or they use a play on words, and they use silly little words over and over again to think, this is comedy, right? No, this isn't comedy. Because again, if we go back to that ancient definition of what comedy was that has run through Western civilization, a comedy is about a person. You're laughing at a person. You're not laughing at words. You're not laughing at something that has been constructed in a playful way. That's not actual comedy. You're laughing at a person when it's comedy. And so in these comics, you see these characters and they keep on using silly words, and they use these silly words over and over again. Why? Because they think this is funny. They think that this can substitute for comedy and that this is comedy in their minds, but it actually isn't. And if you look at these ideas of having something silly happen within the universe itself, well, that breaks down the story in more than just the comedic sense, because if you make these things happen over and over again, which they have, because you have these things like talking animals all the time, this is one of their new tropes, the whole point of why they think it is funny, because it's supposed to be something different than the baseline normal that you're supposed to present as your representation of reality. But if they do it over and over and over again, it is the baseline. It's not a contrary to the baseline, it becomes the baseline itself. And even if this was comedy, which it isn't, then they are destroying the entire basis of what they think is funny by taking this event, which is trying to show that it's a subversion of what normally happens, and make it what actually normally happens. And furthermore, this way of looking at comedy and this explanation of how they use what they think of as being funny, it actually explains something else which they use as a trope. It explains one of the reasons why they are constantly using one specific kind of person to ridicule. Now, these people, they love villains. I have gone over this in a couple of videos, and I just listened to another podcast where they're talking about, oh, villains, they're just so misunderstood. So I'm not talking about villains. I'm talking about when these people present a bully, when they present a mob or something of the kind. They're always made up of one specific kind of person. And that specific kind of person is always white people. And most usually it is white males. Not always. There are white women mixed in there too, but it's usually white men. And these are the bullies. These are the mobs. These are the people that are not actually the villains, but are the bad guy. And they do this, again, quite specifically because of this shame culture that they're trying to implement. Because, of course, in their ideology, there's only one kind of person which you can actually shame and get away with it. Because, of course, their idea of shame, inherent in that idea, is destruction, is harm itself. And so there is one kind of person which you need to destroy, which you need to harm. And those people are, of course, white people. Those are the people you need to harm, especially white men. You have to destroy the patriarchy. And by the way, this is not me just using buzzwords like patriarchy to try to make them look ridiculous. No, when you listen to their podcast, this is what they actually sound like. These are the statements that they actually make. We write this story in order to take down the patriarchy. And again, this goes back to this shame culture, which, if you define it in the way that they do, which is contrary to universals, then it destroys comedy altogether. But here's what I think is the really funny part of this entire thing. If you have somebody who is worse than the norm, and they are presenting something which becomes a comedy, this person, if they truly believe what they are presenting, if they are doing it in an adamant way, well, that becomes a farce. And that's what the comic industry has become. It has become a farce because you have these people who are presenting their progressive arguments to everybody else, but everybody else knows that these progressive arguments are a mistake. We know that they are a deformity of what reality actually is. All you got to do to see that is apply a little bit of reason to it. And you can see that what they are presenting is a deformity of reality. And so in presenting these things, not in actually making the stories, but in presenting these comics in the way that they do, they are the ones who are actually being comedic. They are presenting a comedy to us. I think this is why Richard Meyer over at Comics Matter actually does so well, and why they hate him so much. It's because he's very good at pointing out the fact that these people are acting in a ridiculous way and that we need to laugh at them. I would say this is one of the best tools that we have to deal with these people, is to laugh at them. Because their whole system is built upon this idea of shame, and if you're laughing at them and they see laughter as a type of shaming, well, they're going to be shamed in their own system because you're laughing at them. And so the funny thing is that these writers, these producers, these artists, these colorists, everybody who is a comic producer today, and that includes almost everybody within the industry, since they are presenting to you a deformity of what reality is in these stories and in these comics that they are producing, and they're doing it in a way which they firmly believe it to be the truth, well, what are they doing? Well, they're presenting us a comedy, really. They're presenting us a comedy in the way that they, the actor, is not actually aware of what they are doing to make other people laugh. And there is a simple term that you use to describe these kinds of people. And that term is a clown. And that's quite simply what these people are doing. In presenting us this deformity of reality in this super serious way and expecting us to take it as serious as well, they are simply presenting themselves as the clowns they actually are. So, if I've given you anything new to think about, hit like, hit the shield in the lower right hand corner of your screen to subscribe, and leave me a comment. Tell me what you think about all this. Alright, I'll see you later. Bye.